I'd like to welcome everyone here. If anyone wants to grab a sandwich or a drink and hasn't done so, please feel free. Don't worry about disturbing us. And I'd like to start this event. I'm sorry we're a few minutes late, of an event of the Middle East Task Force here at the New America Foundation, which is part of the American Strategy Program. And well, what we've got here today, as you know, because you've come on the basis of an invitation to this event, is the author of a book that came out last week, Sasha Polakow-Suransky and Tony Karen. I'm going to introduce both of them. And I think what I'm going to do is ask Sasha to make some opening comments and Tony to respond. We might have a short conversation up here before opening out to you. So let me, first of all, introduce our guests here today. Sasha is a senior editor at Foreign Affairs magazine. Sasha was a Rhodes Scholar at Antony College, Oxford. His background is actually of South African Jewish parentage, but you were born in the States already and grew up in Ann Arbor, Michigan, I believe. And to a not insignificant degree of controversy, which probably didn't surprise you all that much, Sasha has just brought out the book, The Unspoken Alliance, Israel's Secret Relationship with Apartheid South Africa. As you may have noticed, there are copies available to be purchased outside. It's a fascinating book. What Sasha does, and it's also beautifully written, by the way. And Sasha has written some follow-up pieces recently. The Israeli government, I don't know how well connected you are with the government and with the leading journalists in Israel. It seems that you must be, because they've been doing some things publicly recently which has no doubt helped raise the profile of your book. So, but I think about 6 weeks ago, something like that. Obviously, people are familiar with the debate that has gone on around the Goldstone report into Operation Cast Lead in Gaza at the end of 2008, beginning of 2009. And that led to a not insignificant and actually quite aggressive at times vilification campaign against Justice Richard Goldstone, obviously a very prominent South African Jew himself. And that clicked into a higher gear a few weeks ago when the leading newspaper in Israel, which was then echoed by Israeli officials and the Speaker of the Knesset and others, published what it claimed to be a great expose, which didn't tell anyone who followed this anything they didn't know already about things that Justice Goldstone did as a judge still in apartheid South Africa, before, of course, serving as the Supreme Court Justice in post-apartheid South Africa and playing a role at the request of Nelson Mandela after he became president. But that brought you very centrally into that conversation. And of course, it's a dual conversation. You get into it in the epilogue, Sasha, and I'm not saying that we should focus on that here. The majority of Sasha's book is really about that relationship, the relationship that developed post-war, since the Second World War, obviously after the creation of the State of Israel, in the 50s, in the 60s, and then really developed depth in the 70s. Between Israel and South Africa, developed a degree of ideological affinity even in the late 70s and early 80s, moving from a more kind of necessitated by Israel's increasing isolation and need for military exports. But I don't want to preempt the story that you're going to tell. And then your epilogue gets into, okay, that's the backdrop of a relationship, and a relationship strongly based in military cooperation, and of course we're in an era in which nuclear non-proliferation is one of the highest agenda items in this current president and administration's foreign policy agenda, and you go into great depth. And I think there was a front page story in The Guardian of new material that you uncovered in the book, suggesting even an attempt at or an offer that Israel made to South Africa in terms of certain nuclear-related weaponry, as well as the cases of joint nuclear testing that it's considered, and you go into this in great detail took place in cooperation between Israel and South Africa. And then there's the other side to the book, which is the contemporary and very controversial comparison between Israel today and aspects of South Africa then. Just to give it even more contemporary relevance, I don't know if people in the room are aware, but South Africa yesterday recalled its ambassador from Israel. One of only two countries, well, the Turks, of course, as well, but I think Ecuador also, who have recalled following the incident with the flotilla of ships, have recalled their ambassador from Tel Aviv. What I'm going to ask Sasha to do is maybe just briefly talk to us about why did you do this book. Help us frame this conversation in terms of what are the bits that you want to pick out from the book. And I think last week you officially launched, and you've probably been running around like crazy since then working on the book. And maybe also go into a little bit the responses you've had to the book. I think it would be interesting to hear that. I'm then going to ask Tony Karen to comment. Tony's a friend. Tony is a South African himself, a South African Jew, someone who grew up in one of the Zionist youth movements that my sister grew up in as well, not in South Africa though, Habonim Dror. Tony became an activist in the struggle in South Africa. He is now a journalist. His first journalistic exposure was in an anti-apartheid magazine called New Era. He then went on to work as a correspondent at the Mail and Guardian Weekly, which is a South African newspaper, and he moved here in 1993. Tony today is a senior editor at Time. He covers world affairs. He covers Middle Eastern affairs. He worked as an editor at Fox News online previously. And Tony blogs, and it's when he has the time, which is more often than me, but not as often as some of the more prolific bloggers here at New America Foundation. Tony blogs at Rootless Cosmopolitan. So what I'm going to ask is Sasha to make some meaty opening comments for us to be able to chew on afterwards, and then I'll turn it over to Tony. Thanks, Sasha.
Thanks, Daniel. Thank you all for coming. I will try not to talk too much so that we can actually have a discussion and so all of you can ask questions towards the end. So I'm going to answer the first question about my interest in the topic and personal reasons for writing this book. My parents are South African Jews, as Daniel mentioned. I was born in the United States. They came in 1973, a few years before I was born, and I grew up in Ann Arbor, Michigan. My parents were active in the anti-apartheid movement on the campus there, and I did grow up surrounded by these sorts of discussions. However, the Israeli-South African relationship wasn't really a core topic. I knew about it. I'd heard about it. It is something that during the 1980s, American anti-apartheid activists used as part of their campaign and would target Israel based on what they knew at the time, which was not a lot. You have to remember that during the 1980s there were no official documents and no interviews with high-level government officials to prove any of this, so it was bits and pieces that leaked out in journalists' reports. People knew something was going on, but not quite what it was. So my interest really developed later on, actually when I was here in D.C. after graduating from Brown University in 2001, 2002. I was working at the American Prospect magazine, and I started to read what had been written on this and get curious. This was a time when there were protests and counter-protests going on in Washington on Israeli-Palestinian issues, and I had also attended the racism conference in Durban, South Africa, a few days before 9/11. And during that conference, as you'll recall, the Israeli delegation and the U.S. delegation walked out, and a lot of the international journalists covering the conference after that walkout began to chatter about this and say, back in the old days, in the 70s and 80s, it was always Israel and South Africa who walked out of these things together, and now the U.S. is. And I didn't know that history at that point very well. I knew about the 1975 Zionism equals racism resolution that has angered Israel ever since, and rightfully so. I did not know the more intricate history of this relationship. So I started to get even more curious after that. And I read the books that had been written on the topic. There were 3 or 4 of them during the 1980s. But as I said earlier, they were not based on archival documents or interviews with the key players. And as I started applying for graduate school, I realized that this was something that I wanted to really delve into more deeply and try and tell the whole story. And that was the beginning of this book project. It began as a PhD project at Oxford. And it was by no means certain that I would get these documents. In Israel, it's impossible. Anything relating to this relationship is very, very difficult to get your hands on. Just to offer an example of how difficult, I have an Israeli friend who also has a family member working in the government and researches 1950s Israeli-Turkish relations, not a particularly controversial topic. And even she can't get a hold of anything. So when you try to get anything on Israel and South Africa, even if it's more than 30 years ago, it's very, very difficult in Israel. What I did get in Israel was interviews with some key players, high-level military officials, who responded once I showed them official, genuine documents from South Africa with their names on them and with dates showing they had been in South Africa, and then people talk. So that is where the Israeli side came in, and from the South African archive, because the South Africans kept meticulous records, and they kept the Israeli side of the correspondence. So if they were signing contracts and writing letters back and forth to each other, all of that's in the South African archive. So there's quite a bit on Israeli letterhead down in Pretoria. So the research took me several years. I waited for 2 years to get the documents in South Africa because even though they have a Freedom of Information Act of their own, which is a very good law, there's still bureaucratic obstruction and sort of inertia more than obstruction. It wasn't politically motivated, but it was slow. And I finally got my hands on all of these Defense Ministry documents in late 2006. And that's when I began to write up the core section of the PhD, which later became the book. I'm going to talk a little bit about the responses. Some of you may have followed this. It, interestingly, has not been particularly well covered in the U.S. press, but in Israel, in South Africa, in Britain, where the whole thing started with the Guardian front page article, and then many other countries that I never expected to take an interest at all, like Brazil, Turkey, Germany. I've been getting calls from some unusual places who are newspapers and radio that are interested in this story. The Guardian story focused on a very, very narrow piece of the book. It takes up about half a page, actually. It's not what I would have chosen as the key revelation or the most shocking revelation, but it would have been on the top 10 list. This is a discussion, or a series of discussions, in 1975 between Defense Minister Shimon Peres and South African Defense Minister P.W. Botha that took place both in South Africa and in Switzerland between May and June 1975. And the minutes from these meetings that were top secret documents in the South African Military Intelligence Archive record Shimon Peres's comments and responses to requests and proposals by the South African Defense Minister P.W. Botha. And essentially what these documents show us is that there was a high-level discussion about the possible transfer of nuclear-tipped Jericho missiles from Israel to South Africa. The deal was never consummated. There's no evidence that Yitzhak Rabin, then the Prime Minister, had actually approved the deal. However, the documents do show very clearly that Peres participated in these discussions, was present, and that an offer of sorts was on the table. Even if it did not have the Prime Minister's approval, and even if it eventually did not go through for reasons of cost, and because South Africa was also developing its own nuclear capability at that point and had invested a great deal of time and energy and money in an indigenous nuclear enrichment capability and was starting to move towards weaponization in 1975. So that is what The Guardian chose to focus on, and that is the story that sort of made it around the world. What I would like to add to that, and what you can read about in the book, is that this does not end in 1975 with this aborted transaction. the cooperation on nuclear-capable missiles actually continues well into the 80s through to 1989, 1990 on the south coast of South Africa at a secret testing range called Overberg near the town of Arniston, where dozens of Israeli scientists traveled to help the South Africans build their delivery systems that they intended to use with their next generation of miniaturized nuclear warheads. So rather than going through with the deal and purchasing from Israel in 1975, the South Africans pursued their own program, but cooperated extensively with the Israelis, who were more advanced in the field of rocketry and missile technology. And so it became a joint financing arrangement, a joint research and development project, rather than a direct transfer. That's okay. This went on until '89, 2 years after Israel had imposed its own sanctions against South Africa. And in '89, the American and Soviet intelligence satellites pick up a missile launch off the south coast of South Africa. That's reported in the British and American press. And the Defense Intelligence Agency here and the CIA pick up on it as well, and their declassified memos on this launch show that they thought that there had either been a direct transfer of Israeli technology or a very close joint development project, because the trail, the plume as they call it, of this missile taking off from the south coast of South Africa was identical to that of the Jericho 2 system in Israel. President Bush Sr., 41, was not happy about this. And he called out Yitzhak Shamir, and this eventually led to the winding down of South Africa's missile program, which was a key part of the nuclear program in the 80s. The other major revelation, and then I'm going to shut up, is that South Africa from the 1960s actually was selling uranium, yellow cake uranium, to the Israelis. And this was done under a bilateral safeguards agreement. And so rather than going through international organizations, Vienna, they did it themselves. The South Africans visited to check that the uranium wasn't being used for military purposes. And this built up over the years. And in 1976, there was quite a bit of it, 500 tons. And the Israeli intelligence agencies wanted to use this for the Israeli nuclear program, because they were having trouble sourcing at this point. And so the head of the LACOM, the Scientific Intelligence Unit, approaches the Prime Minister in South Africa and asks for the safeguards to be lifted so that they can do whatever they want with the stockpile. And Vorster, the South African Prime Minister, sends his mining minister, a guy named Fani Botha, on a trip to Israel. And this is recorded on Israeli Defense Ministry letterhead. Fani Botha goes to Israel in July 1976. He meets with Peres, he meets with Rabin, he meets with the head of the Israeli nuclear agency, he meets with other leading generals like Chaim Bar-Lev, and he lifts the safeguards. And this he related to me at length in an interview, and it's also recorded in an in-camera trial record of a case that was a big scandal in South Africa in the late 70s and through the 1980s. And the Israelis were funneling money to this mining minister, Fani Botha, in order to keep him in his portfolio until this deal went through, because he was facing personal bankruptcy, and there was a lot of fear within South Africa that his political career was over. And the Israelis worried that if he did not stay in power, that this might not go through. And this also is all recorded in the South African Supreme Court record from this trial in 1988. The other quid pro quo in the deal was a small amount of tritium, which is a substance used to boost the yield of advanced thermonuclear weapons, which the South Africans hope to use with their new arsenal. So that is a longer and more complicated story, but I've tried to give you a brief outline because it actually is, in my opinion, a more shocking revelation than what the Guardian chose to focus on. At this point, I'd like to turn it over to Tony a little bit, and maybe he can ask some questions about the contemporary issues, and then we can go to the audience and discuss whatever you're interested in talking about. Thank you.
Before we do that, we're also live streaming on the New America Foundation website, and I should have mentioned that and welcome the people who are watching this online. I'm going to turn it over to Tony. I'm going to also want to, I think, maybe follow up on that, because I think one of the reasons that The Guardian paid so much attention and other people may be paying attention to what you elaborated on now, not just what The Guardian chose to focus on, is, of course, in an era and a time in which at the MPT review conference just last month there was a renewed call for a Middle East WMD-free zone. Obviously, Israel has pursued a policy of opacity, of ambiguity, but I think Israel has also been able to make a credible claim to say, well, look, and if we did, we've been a very responsible nuclear actor. There's no proliferation issues with us, and that's where I think maybe not so much in terms of what your book would have pointed out. By the way, one of the great things in the book is, as you said, you've got access to these South African documents, but it's also your access to the people. I mean, it's the stories that you tell of sitting in a shopping mall in a suburb of Joburg with the ex-head of the Air Force or the National Intelligence, or on the Israeli side, sitting with the ex-ambassador here, actually, David Ivry, who played a senior role in Israel's security establishment, and others, and many of them apparently were really quite open with you, as well as all the folks who were my friends there who feature in your story. Tony, you grew up around this. In South Africa, in the South African Jewish community, in the South African Zionist community. I'm not saying share all your childhood memories with us, but as a point of departure, which you just did on the train, and so some of them are good, and I hope you do. But maybe come up here and kind of pick up on that and on what Sasha's been talking about.
Yeah, thanks, Daniel. And Sasha, for what I loved about this book actually was the way that it connected the dots of so much of what Daniel says was our experience, bits and pieces of things that you were kind of vaguely aware of at the periphery. You know, you'd be sitting and watching a cricket match in South Africa, and some guy would come who you knew from a Jewish day school, who was now doing his military service, would come and let on that he had a very plum posting. He didn't have to do all the kind of infantry work that everybody else did, by virtue of the fact that he'd gone to a Jewish day school in South Africa where, because the national curriculum required that everybody learn Afrikaans and English, and the Jewish day school curriculum required that they learn Hebrew, he was this very rare entity, a Hebrew Afrikaans translator, and the SADF needed many of these because there were a lot of Israelis in South Africa, military people working with the SADF, and that was something we didn't know. So it was a little flag for the kind of lefty progressive Zionists that we were at the time. We would also notice little things like the R4, what the South African Defence Force called the R4 rifle, which is kind of a knockoff of a Kalashnikov. You'd see all these photographs from Israel and Lebanon. You'd be, hang on a second, that's the same rifle. And then, but it was called the Galil. And you do a bit of investigation and you find, well, actually, it is the same rifle. It's developed jointly by the two countries and manufactured under license in South Africa. So clearly, this kind of thing was going on, but the full depth of it was pretty shocking, actually. Which, thanks to Sasha's work, we have a better picture of. The politics of it also was kind of a little bizarre because, as Sasha draws out very, very well, the apartheid regime originates in with a national party that was overtly anti-Semitic and Nazi-aligned in the 1930s. So the personal memory for me, the first memory of sort of being subjected to any kind of really scary anti-Semitism as opposed to sort of, country club prejudice was at school we were forced, for the first 2 years of high school, to do woodwork. It was the first year in my particular school, which was a mixed English Afrikaans school, that there was a significant number of Jewish kids. There were about 12 of us. So 7 boys in this woodwork class. I have to sympathize with any woodwork teachers having to, teach woodwork to a bunch of Jewish nebbishes, but at some point, this man, like a lot of the teachers at the time, would cane us in the classroom. I mean, they were very violent. He was also a drunkard. I mean, I think he might have had a hangover that day. He came into the classroom in a black rage. Nobody understood what was going on. And he suddenly turned around to the class and he said, the problem with this class is there are too many Jews here. We were all like, it was very terrifying. You're 13 years old. You're just starting to hear about the Holocaust. And suddenly you're on somebody else's radar as a problem. A week later, he came into the classroom and said, did anybody hear me say anything about Jews last week? we kind of knew that we knew the correct answer. We all kept our hands down, except for one very brave young man who the teacher pretended he just hadn't seen. And I asked my father years later about it. My father was a macher in B'nai B'rith, and the parent organization of the ADL, was kind of connected in Jewish communal circles, the Board of Deputies, and so on. Why it was that a school like mine, where the Broederbond, the top 3 positions in the school were all known Broederbonders. This was very loyal to the regime and the National Party, and the woodwork teachers' anti-Semitism was pretty much that was the the prevailing ideology. Why had they seen it as necessary to actually retract, to put pressure on this man to actually walk back from what he'd said the previous week? And without my father knew the answer immediately. He said that it was Israel. The South African regime at that point knew it needed its relationship with Israel, and therefore that it couldn't really afford to carry on business as usual with the old anti-Semitism. It simply had to be reined in. When they first showed the World at War series, the documentary series on South African television, they actually planned to keep the Holocaust episode out because they didn't like talking about the Holocaust. It wasn't in our school curriculum of World War II. And, the Board of Deputies put pressure on them and they showed that episode because it was just like, okay, you don't want to have problems with the Jews. Yeah, I think that the bigger picture of how all this fit together was very well illuminated in Sasha's book. But I think the wider political significance of that book right now is highlighted, in many ways by what we saw happening over the past week, the flotilla debacle, where you have a group of international civil society activists putting together an aid shipment whose purpose is clearly to challenge the blockade. It's a protest action. And, there's the violent response. We all know. I'm not going to get into, who did what to whom, at which point. But I think that what you can see in that incident that's so worrying to the Israelis is that what you're seeing is an international civil society movement that's not prepared to accept Israel's narrative, that's basically pushing governments who are inclined to accept Israel's narrative or to give a nod and a wink to Israel's actions like the blockade. The Obama administration might have criticized the blockade, said this is not productive, this is not going to help, etc., but not really acted in its first year in office to do anything about it. Suddenly you have these groups who are forcing the issue onto the agenda. And really that's very reminiscent of the anti-apartheid movement in the West in the 1980s, where for Cold War reasons at that time, a lot of those governments were inclined, would criticize apartheid and say this is wrong, it's not productive, you need to do something about this. But for Cold War reasons would give a nod and a wink to the apartheid regime. And it was really civil society groups that pushed the issue onto the agenda that created a situation in which the governments were forced to distance themselves. So I think for the Israelis, they're seeing something that's very dangerous to them. And I think that, Sasha's book is I'm sure not very welcome for those reasons. I think also what you see as a result of in the flotilla moment is another instance highlighting what Peter Beinart has been talking about in the debate unleashed by the essay that he wrote in the New York Review of Books about how young Jewish Americans are more and more inclined to not accept Israel's narrative a priori, and not to subordinate their liberal values to the sort of the idea that Zionism trumps liberal values, that not to put Israel first, not to accept behavior in Israel that wouldn't be acceptable by any other government. And I saw the Forward yesterday or 2 days ago wrote that the flotilla incident had been a Rorschach test of Jewish America. And, what you can see in that is that younger Jewish Americans successfully integrated into the United States, and they're not really experiencing anti-Semitism as a lived reality for themselves, are more and more inclined to judge Israel in the way they would judge any other country. And obviously apartheid is a sort of synonym for that which is unacceptable, in the West, and as such, to draw a connection, I think, as Sasha has done, to highlight the fact that there was this connection between the apartheid regime and Israel is obviously something that's very uncomfortable. I think ultimately, the reason is obvious, as Sasha makes clear in his book. Israel And the key, one of the major differences between Israel and South Africa in terms of their diplomatic situations is that South Africa had no diaspora. South Africa had no constituencies abroad who were able to prevail on Western governments to show more tolerance, understanding, acceptance, support for them on the basis of an historical experience that has sort of shamed the West. Actually, you know, truth be told, Afrikaners were the first people in concentration camps. The word was actually invented by the British during the Boer War, and it was part of their counter-insurgency strategy to simply round up the Boer women and children, put them in concentration camps. They used the word, and you know, a huge proportion of the Afrikaner population died in those camps, which was, you know, but you know, nonetheless, nothing on the scale of the Holocaust, of course. I'm not drawing any such comparison. But the point is that Israel needs to be able to not only for the support, to retain the support of young liberal American Jews, but also to be able to prevail on Western powers for understanding, to be able to point to the Holocaust experience and to demand a certain level of support and understanding on the basis of that, on the basis of a never again idea, on the basis that Israel speaks for the Jews. When that discord starts to happen, when actually young American Jews are clearly are increasingly at odds with that premise, that I think is a very difficult situation for Israel. And it's the kind of thing, I mean, I'm sure it's shaping a lot of the response you're getting to the book. There's an interest. I mean, obviously, the book also, particularly in the epilogue and in the prologue, deals with the question of the analogy. You know, to what extent is Israel an apartheid situation? Obviously, for the same reasons, that's a very powerful and provocative discussion, and sort of. Jimmy Carter would know, you know, bringing up that topic is you know, can be very dangerous. I mean, he was called the Holocaust denier for bringing that up. But at the same time, you know, as Sasha points out, Ehud Olmert has said the same thing. Ehud Barak, a couple of months ago, said the same thing. And, you know, often, I mean, one point in which I might take a little issue on your characterization is the idea that it's at the point at which Palestinians become 50% plus one, it becomes an apartheid situation. I'm not sure that you put it as crudely as that, but the idea that it's a quantifiable measure, that when Palestinians become the majority between the West Bank and between the Jordan and the sea is the moment which it becomes an apartheid situation. But I suggest that actually in many ways it's a qualitative definition. As you know, Barak himself said, well, if you have a population living under Israeli rule, but with no rights, none of the rights, democratic rights of Israelis, that's an apartheid situation. And he spoke about it as, you know, if you have that, but at the same time he's tacitly acknowledging, well, that is the reality of the occupation. So I think that, you know, there's never any kind of cookie cutter set of definitions, and certainly of solutions to any situation. I don't think South Africa and Israel are at all similar in terms of their political geography. I think that the two situations are very different, and they are, you know, the purpose, the structure of those systems is very different. We could, you know, go into that at length. But I think that, you know, the real problem that I think the Israelis have, and that, you know, Olmert and Barak and acknowledging Jimmy Carter was drawing attention to, is the kind of moral equivalence where, you know, at the end of the day, on that the substantial question not of the detail of the system, but the idea that people are living under a regime in which they have no democratic rights. They're not given the rights of citizenship in the state that rules over them. That, in some ways, is the qualitative essence of what apartheid is. Whether that population is 40% or 60% is less of the issue than their status. Okay. Yeah. You know, I'm going to leave it there. I mean, I have a couple more points. We can bring them up in conversation. This is your day.
So maybe just first immediately turn to you if there's anything you want to respond to on that.
Go ahead.
Well, before I open it up, and one of the things that I mean, really the end of the relationship, formally, although it carries on quietly, but where Israel formally gets on board with what has already become a global sanctions regime. Yes, there's been actors in Israel who have been pushing for that for some time. And in the 80s, when this takes place, is a period in Israel where there are unity governments, where Labour and Likud are sharing power. And it kind of goes through three phases, I think, that you define. One, you've got and while Labour is still in power, which is until 1977, you have a group of the state-founding Labour leadership who, to the extent to which they're willing to go along with it, are initially very uncomfortable, the Golda Meir world. Then it's the kind of Rabin gruff realism of post-Yom Kippur 1973 war. Israel needs a market for its military exports. This is incredibly important for Israel. South Africa needs to be buying weapons from somewhere, and that match is made. There's no love particularly, and there's no pride, but it is what it is. And then the period of more ideological affinity once the Likud first come into power in 77, and then a period where there's a real debate in Israel, where there are those who say, look, there are practical political reasons and moral reasons why this is no longer a good idea. The one notable exception, as you point out, I think you call him the ever sanctimonious Shimon Peres, who's currently the president, who manages to, I mean, this is just a line that I have to quote, a letter that Shimon Peres sends that you've uncovered to the South African leadership. I think he was on a visit there, a secret visit in 1974, and he thanks his hosts in the South African leadership for the visit and writes that our cooperation is not based only on common interests, also on the unshakable foundations of our common hatred of injustice and our refusal to submit to it. And you go after Shimon again today in an op-ed that you have in Haaretz, and you ask for Peres to come clean. When Israel finally gets on board, at least publicly, is where there's pressure from here. And actually AIPAC steps up as the adult in the room. And there's congressional legislation that's being discussed, an Anti-Apartheid Act, and there's a section in that, Section 508, which poses a problem for Israel, for the US-Israel relationship. And AIPAC are warning the Israelis, hey, pay attention. You earlier show that really they're the adult in the room in the Jewish community, because other Jewish communal organizations have been part of the American Jewish Committee, have tried to downplay. The links are tiny, they're minor. The ADL is somehow involved in collecting information on anti-apartheid activists. Ed Kochakov chimes in and defends Israel. It's funny that those players seem to play a similar role today. And then AIPAC kind of says, wait, pay attention. And the Israelis eventually do pay attention, belatedly. How... I mean, maybe just tease out some more of that for us. And how do you see that in today's terms? And maybe if Tony can address the same thing, and then I'm going to open it up.
Okay.
I mean, we could probably just, I'll stand on the side.
Do you want me to?
Yeah, probably easier for you to.
From here? I'll stand on the side. Okay. Let me explain briefly what happened in 1986-87. I don't want to get too much into the historical detail because it's complicated, and then we can move on to questions. Essentially what happened is anti-apartheid legislation was moving forward in Congress in 86, and it had widespread support on both sides of the aisle. And many of Israel's greatest friends in Congress were vehemently anti-apartheid as well. And so the Israeli government did not see this coming. And again, as Daniel was saying, it was a unity government, so it's going from Peres to Shamir, and they do not, especially Shamir, they do not realize that this amendment, Section 508, which essentially said anyone who continues to violate the arms embargo against South Africa risks losing military and economic aid from the United States. So it was a not-so-veiled threat at Israel. And so lefties in Israel, people like Yossi Beilin, immediately react and start to use this as an argument with the leadership, like we have to get out of this relationship with South Africa, otherwise the axe is going to fall on us. But the Israeli government still doesn't budge because they think Reagan's going to veto the legislation. And so they constantly say to AIPAC, oh, no, it's going to be fine because he'll veto it. Of course, what happened in the end is Reagan did veto it, and Congress overrode that veto massively. and the Anti-Apartheid Act becomes law. Section 508 is in. It mandates a congressional report on violators of the arms embargo, which comes out in April of '87, and names Israel most prominently alongside a few others who are still selling weapons, but Israel is by far the biggest violator. And so at this point, Israel has to go along and impose sanctions. So they do so, but if you look at the data, the purchasing data from South Africa, the arms deals actually spike in '88 and '89, and the graph goes like this, because they're trying to exhaust all remaining arms deals. And then we get to the moment in 1989 with the missile launch, which I started with, when Bush really cracks down and says, hey, you guys are violating your own sanctions now. So what's interesting about this, obviously, is that AIPAC in 1986, comes off looking rather heroic, or at least very politically astute. If you look at the contemporary landscape, it's difficult to say the same thing. A lot of people will look back at the 80s and say, okay, here is a moment when Israel is clearly shooting itself in the foot in terms of public relations, and AIPAC recognized this and acted to try and prevent Israel from continuing to do that. You don't really see the same sort of reaction today from major Jewish organizations in the U.S., and this is something that's been taken up at length by Peter Beinart in the article from a few weeks ago that Daniel and Tony were referring to. This sort of narrowing of what pro-Israel means in the American Jewish community to a point that people of my generation, American Jews in their 20s and 30s, don't identify with it anymore and can't reconcile their political liberalism, the political liberalism that they've inherited from their parents, with the Zionism of their parents' generation, because while they continue to identify with these politically liberal ideals in the domestic context in the U.S., they can't identify with a love for Israel when the Israel that they see in the news every day is Bibi Netanyahu's Israel, the flotilla incident, the continuous building of settlements, and these sorts of things. And Peter Beinart has elaborated on this much more than I have in the book, and I do recommend that article. So the basic point here, to answer your question, is that that level of intervention and that level of foresight that you saw in AIPAC and a few other American Jewish organizations in the mid-'80s who were aware of and sensitive to the growing anti-apartheid sentiment within the American Jewish community, you don't quite see that recognition today of the generational divide that is emerging in the American Jewish community. So let me leave it at that, and Tony can respond a bit, and then we can go to audience questions. Does that sound good?
I don't really have a lot to say on that specific issue, but I think what perhaps by way of comparison, would wonder if the 1986 moment was a very different balance of political balance in Washington, apropos Israel and apropos a whole lot of other things. What's interesting to me is how things changed in Washington in the 1990s for a whole number of reasons. I think one of the ones I tend to emphasize is that in some ways the leadership of the Christian right that was pulling the Republican Party rightwards around, in the late 80s, 1990, is Pat Buchanan. It's sort of right-wing Catholic and, probably anti-Semitic, if anything. Certainly not at all, friendly towards Israel. And in the 1990s, it's very clear things shift. The voice that's pulling the Republican Party further and further to the right is evangelical Christian, philo-Semitic, pro-Israel, Christian Zionists, actually, they would call themselves overtly. And you sort of wonder if, the circumstances in which Israel asks the United States to be treated as an exception to rules that the United States is trying to impose more generally, like the NPT is a perfect example, that there's a lot more sympathy for Israel's demand for sort of exceptional treatment on Capitol Hill today than there would have been in 1986. I think that the NPT thing was remarkable in the sense that the Obama administration is forced to basically ask Israel to sign on to the NPT, but sort of throws in a few caveats in there that sort of give space for the Israelis to say, it's not something we're going to do right now and for the foreseeable future. And that it creates a problem for the U.S. non-proliferation agenda. It creates a problem probably in terms of winning middle ground Arab and other support on the Iran issue. But it speaks to me of the way in which that balance has kind of changed, that what's acceptable, what's possible politically for Israel and supporters is quite different after the 90s than what it was probably in the late 80s.
By the way, one of the things that I found most fascinating in that story is I think there was a very smart, forward-thinking, far-sightedness, just to saying, listen, inside the Democratic Party, the Jewish Black Alliance is really important, and this matters in Congress. I think one of the fascinating things is that Congressional Black Caucus has largely stayed on side with Israel. And a fascinating question for me is, if the struggle increasingly focuses on things that begin to look like a civil rights struggle, and go back to, it's a year today, I think, go back to Barack Obama's speech in Cairo. He uses that analogy. When he essentially turns to Hamas, he doesn't say, hey, Khaled, listen to me. But he starts addressing essentially how the Palestinians go about their struggle. He wrongly recalls parts of the South African struggle, but he talks about the civil rights struggle in the US, which this was a classic, I think this week was in most respects a classic example of. Now, at what stage by the way, I think there are younger members in Congressional Black Caucus today, newer members. I don't know if they'll be happy that I'm mentioning them now, but people I have respect for, such as Donna Edwards and Keith Ellison, who are making this very much part of their broader worldview and agenda. And it's just an interesting thing, I think, that's going to be to follow in the next years. Are the John Lewises going to speak out on this? Donald Payne, it does. But anyway, just to make that point. Well, I'm going to open it up. I know there's a question here. It's really difficult to see, by the way, so I can see you. But we'll start with 1, 2, 3.
Thank you, Daniel. Tom Getman, former Hill staffer and an NGO executive in Israel and Palestine. I've just returned from 3 months in South Africa, researching my own writing. I was one of the 4 Senate authors for the sanctions legislation. And I spent a lot of time in South Africa starting in the late 70s, and spent a lot of time at the Mail and Guardian.
I say get to the question, but I'm not going to, because this is interesting.
What I discovered, and I have a question about now, in those days was that we had very strong support from Afrikaners in Parliament and in the embassy who were terrified by the terrible lack of moral suasion around critical issues and parted company with apartheid, and including Bucas, who was recalled because he said it was immoral. And parliamentarians told me last month that they inside were having these tremendous debates in the ministerial meetings. Are you finding the same thing today? Are there people in the diplomatic corps of Israel? Are there people who are members of Knesset who are really pushing the envelope to bring about the same sort of change that we saw in South Africa, in Israel and Palestine?
We'll take a couple at a time, and to keep it easy, we'll stay in the front, and then we're going to go back to... Okay, we're not staying in the front. Nusha, here. Sorry. Thanks.
All right, Bruce Woolman. I have a two-parter for Tony. What were the decisions in the editorial boardrooms that made Sasha's book not get covered in the U.S.? And as a person who very often dismisses or corrects American and Israeli narratives, how do you keep your job?
This is obviously, a tricky one, and I'm obviously not speaking on behalf of any media organization in this sense, but my sense of watching this process over the years is that I think there's probably a prevailing sentiment in a lot of mainstream media outlets of a desire to kind of avoid getting into trouble. It's not even a political choice, or it is a political choice, but it's not necessarily often imagined as such. But there's a sort of sense of, not necessarily courting controversy, looking for, being able to comment in a way that doesn't seem too extreme. I mean, I think Sasha's book has gotten some coverage. I haven't really been, I haven't really done the media study comprehensively to look at it. But I think, there's probably an instinct amongst
Sasha
many.
Probably has.
Yeah. There's probably an instinct among many editors to looking at what happened to Jimmy Carter, and I mean, I'm not speaking, for my own publication here, but looking at what happened to Jimmy Carter, just going, what, this is going to cause too much trouble. It's going to elicit, a furious response from, people who are influential, and, do we need this headache and this kind of climate? I think that's more what it is. I don't think there's a lot of people going, we've read Sasha's book and he's wrong about a lot of these things. It's just, sometimes there's perhaps an instinct to avoid controversy. But that said, I mean, I think there are plenty of media outlets that will give it, the time of day. I mean, I don't think the media in any ways is sort of monolithic. I've certainly never had any problem, expressing. Doing the analysis that I did, because I try and be objective. It's not, I do think, objectivity is a very fine value for journalists to pursue. And objectivity is not necessarily moral neutrality. It's not imagining necessarily that you can avoid sort of sympathizing, morally with one side or another. But I think objectivity is about distinguishing between the world as it is and the world as we want it to be actually providing some sense of the way things are going to unfold, rather than the way we necessarily would like them to unfold. And I think, there are plenty of journalists in the U.S. media who are able to, cover these things, I think, without necessarily courting any sort of approbation. So, I'm answering this as best I can. But yeah, I mean, I don't think the U.S. media is under a gag in any sense in dealing with this question. It's really up to individual journalists to.
I'm going to ask Sasha to comment on the other question.
I'm going to just say a few words on this, and then I think Daniel would be the best person to answer the contemporary Israeli Knesset politics. It has been covered a bit. Newsweek ran a review yesterday, so I don't think it's early yet. So hopefully there will be others. So I do think that there's certain radio stations that have been very, very touchy about this in New York City, and bookstores in New York City. I have a number of events here and in San Francisco. Other than the Council on Foreign Relations, by no means a bastion of lefty radicalism, but happens to be my employer. We had an event there, so it's getting some attention here. But obviously, media in other countries, especially Israel, that's the irony here. I mean, the Israeli media has been completely open to this. Radio, TV, newspapers giving me response space to people who've attacked me. So, I mean, the Israeli media is to be commended on that count for being far more open. But so I don't think that the situation's quite so bad. But there are definitely people who are reluctant. And I think some of these radio shows, mainstream radio shows, feel like they're going to get massive backlash from their listeners and they don't want to touch it. But then you've got people like Amy Goodman at Democracy Now! and KPFA and KPFK on the West Coast that are happy to do this sort of thing. So let's leave it at that, and maybe you could answer the Knesset question.
Yeah, I mean, I'll when was that you were referring to the years?
Well, we wrote
That's, I mean, but
it was
and look, without drawing the analogy, but the situations kind of exactly overlap. I mean, Israel's in a particular. I just came back last night from Israel. Wasn't planned that I was going to be there in a week like this. Yeah, there were spontaneous demonstrations of support for the IDF, for what happened. Yes, some of it was mobilized. Obviously there are groups that mobilize on the right, but that's honestly not really the story. It was the Israeli. The criticism of what happened is focused on the micro tactics of the way in which boarding the boat, preventing it from getting to Gaza, was managed. So it is, to the extent to which there's less, there are not officials, publicly at least, speaking out, and I want to kind of address that in a sec. Yeah, this is representative of the main opposition party, Kadima, is foursquare behind the government on this. Yeah, it is reflective of where society is in a hunker down, turning in on itself, self-righteous place. Not everyone. Let me be very clear. There was a demonstration on the day it happened. On Monday night outside the Defence Ministry, there'll be a larger than regular demonstration. Well, there will be. It's happened already. It's 8:30 in the evening. In Sheikh Jarrah today, there will be a demonstration tomorrow in Tel Aviv. It's 43 years since the beginning of the occupation, plus to look back on the events of this week. But I think to a certain extent, people have filtered themselves out of officialdom. I wouldn't be able to go into this statistically, but I think the voices are still there, and they'll find their voice, and people do find their voice, and the people that Sasha mentions in his book, Yossi Beilin and Shlomo Gore and Alon Liel and Shimshon Zelnicka and David Kimchi, who passed away earlier this year, who were fighting to change the South Africa policy, and some then became ambassadors to post-apartheid South Africa. Those people are still there. They are less in positions of power. We're going to go to the back here. This gentleman who's, I can definitely see your hand.
There's a woman in the third.
Well,
Right.
Thank you very much. The reason I wanted to
Could people introduce themselves? Sorry.
Yes, my name is Ni Akwete, and now I do Africa policy analysis independently, but from 81 till 92, I worked at Trans-Africa. One of my jobs, one little assignment I had to do was to write to the Israeli embassy here, protesting at what we then knew about the relationship between the two countries. So, and I've seen you on Democracy Now! Daniel has caused me problems because I'm not supposed to buy books. But he said your book is wonderfully written, so now I have to decide. My question is about the anti-apartheid movement here. During your research, I'm wondering if you talked to some of the leaders like Walter Fontroy and Randall Robinson. And then since the book came out, I have been very fascinated, but I haven't seen any opinions on their part. And I'm wondering what your sense of it is, especially given that there was a part about somebody spying on the anti-apartheid movement.
Thanks for that. Nusha, if you take the mic to the person who was sitting right in front of you. Yeah. Joel.
Joel Peters. One quick comment and then a question. The comment is about the 1986 and about how much, the analogy to today. In the mid-80s, Israel just didn't understand the US positioning on Africa at all, on its whole view towards Africa and South Africa. It just didn't get it, and that's why it got kind of blindsided and AIPAC had to step in. I think an analogy is that today, Israel might not be getting current discourses going on in the United States and globally. So there's like the blind spot was there in the 80s, and there's a blind spot today, and it's an ongoing problem in Israel. My question is really, do you deal with, and it's both to Tony and Sasha, is a question about the Jewish factor in this whole relationship, the whole question of the Jewish community in South Africa, and the whole issue with the Jewish activism and the anti-apartheid struggle within South Africa, and the Israeli relationship within that sort of triangle, and how that impacted on the relationship in the 60s and then through into the 70s.
Because we have a lot of hands up, we're going to take one more question.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Rosemary Segero. I'm the president of Hope for Tomorrow. We focus mainly on women and young people, especially in conflict countries. Now that you've written that wonderful book of on South Africa and Israel, I'm writing a book on giving back to Africa. Now that you've written that book on South Africa and Israel, looking at what you have written, how are you going back to give back to South Africa, looking at what you have written, especially on women and children? And how do you see South Africa changing from the time you wrote the book up to this time? I would like part of that money to go to South Africa. Thank you.
Should I start?
I'm not answering any of these questions.
Okay. Let me start with the question from this side about anti-apartheid leaders. I actually had quite a bit of trouble getting people to talk to me about this. I did reach out to the people that you mentioned, and was not able to interview them in the time frame that I needed to in order to complete the book. I think that there will be some response from the African American community. I certainly hope so, because this is a topic that was, as you said, a primary interest in the 80s, and people like you were working on it full time. I did speak with a few people in Congress, John Conyers, who took an active role in this, but not as many as I would have liked to be honest. And I haven't seen as much of a response in African American media outlets, but it has only been about 10 days, and there is some interest. Earl Ofari Hutchinson is having me on his show in LA tomorrow, actually, and so there are people, and I would hope that there'll be more interest, because there is a whole chapter of the book devoted to this this period when the Black Jewish Alliance inside the Democratic Party was faltering, and this was a wedge issue that was a real problem, and there were people in Congress, Wolpe and Leland, trying to sort of hold this together. And so I think it's a very interesting period, and I hope that some of the stalwarts of the anti-apartheid movement in the 80s will take notice and interest in it. Joel, your question about the position, not understanding the position on Africa and whether that relates to now. Could you just remind me, sorry, what the actual question part of it was? I think
Tony will come into that. Okay. Tony will address the second one, maybe. But
I'll say one thing about it. I remember that the question now. The South African Jewish community did play a role in this. I called it a sort of triangle of love and fear. There was a cognitive dissonance where people wanted this relationship to be there because it made them feel more secure. There was this residual fear of the Nazis and these pro-Nazi Afrikaners, and it was a very real fear in the late 40s and early 50s. Like these guys had been supporting the Nazis during the war, and there was a fear that Jews would be oppressed as blacks were in South Africa. That fades in the 50s because the National Party needs to let Jews in and get all of the white support that they can get in order to maintain their hold on power and not let liberal white opposition parties take over. So they realized they needed the Jews, and then by the 60s and 70s you see this very the 70s and 80s especially, the close relationship developed with Israel, and at that point I argue that these fears may have been there, but that they were unfounded, because if the apartheid regime had turned against the Jews in the 1970s and 80s, when everything else was going on, when you have, Soweto and the state of emergency and sanctions coming up in Congress, can you imagine what would have happened? I mean, they wouldn't have done it, and so it's an unfounded fear. Let me just answer your question, ma'am, in the front. I do plan to go to South Africa in a few weeks. The book is out there. And I'm planning to not only speak at think tanks like this, but also to go into schools in the townships in South Africa and try and really talk about this history. And there's certain activist groups. Zaki Ahmad, the former leader of the Treatment Action Campaign, has been very involved in the rollout of the book there, and we're both adamant about taking this beyond the sort of think tank circuit and really trying to discuss this history and make it available to people in schools in the townships outside of Cape Town and Johannesburg who may not have access to books and really get it out there. So I take your question to heart, and I'm going to be working on that when I go down to South Africa at the end of the month. And Tony, why don't you respond to the?
Well, yeah. On Joel's question, I think that I mean I think you're right that it was an unfounded fear, but I think by that point, by the 80s, it had become just an ingrained political behavior. The South African organized Jewish community, the Board of Deputies, the sort of official institutions that claim to speak on behalf of Jews were very quiescent with apartheid, were very reluctant to do anything that challenged the regime, and were actually uncomfortable when Israel was in the early 60s doing that. They were actually asking Israel to kind of go a little easy because of the situation of South African Jews as they saw it. There was a huge tradition of Jewish activism in the liberation movement at the point at which, I mean, if you look at Nelson Mandela's trial, there are 4 white men on trial with him, all of whom are Jewish. At the point at which I joined the ANC, I think about 60% probably of the older generation of leaders in exile, 60 to 70% were Jewish. It was sort of, you'd meet these legends and they'd have the same Yiddish accent as my grandmother. I could actually I spoke Yiddish with Ray Alexander. It was one of the high points of my struggle career. I'd play Jewish geography with Joe Slovo. It's like, oh yeah, you once went out with so-and-so. It was, but it really, there was a very established Jewish presence, but it was an absolute minority within the community. I mean, it's almost a little comical how latterly, in the post-apartheid era, the official Jewish community has tried to embrace all of these kind of figures, anyone who kind of made a contribution, sort of just ignoring the fact that contribution was made pretty much almost in dissidence from the mainstream community. And Goldstone, perfect example. He was lionized for his role. Until the Goldstone report came out, and then he had trouble attending his grandson's bar mitzvah. So I think the Jewish communal politics in relation to these issues was sort of complicated and contested, even to the point that you make clear in your book, the Board of Deputies is hosting Foster when he comes back from Israel, and there's a couple of hundred, a lot of them Habonim kids, actually protesting outside, and we were told in no uncertain terms that we had better shut up because we would lose all funding and all support, whatever, from the official Jewish community if we interfered with the Israel relationship. It was all very well to be radical and kibbutznik and so on and have a beard and wear a blue shirt, but you did not touch the regime because that would be trouble for Israel and yeah.
Okay, we're going to go to the back. There are 2 hands.
I'm Betsy Spiro Clark, and I'm a retired Foreign Service officer who served in South Africa in the mid-'80s in Johannesburg. But my question is really a small question about words. I was in Israel a year ago, and on the left, people that I was talking with were using the term Spartate, that they didn't want Israel to become a combination of a militarized Sparta and an apartheid regime. And I'd be rather interested in whether you think this is, the term and think it's widespread. And the second part of the question is that they were always saying this in terms of there are a lot of Israelis who aren't going to want to live in Israel if it becomes a Spartate regime. So if you could comment, thank you.
And then...
Thank you.
Marilyn Sefocle, president of the Women Ambassadors Foundation. You mentioned earlier the lack of engagement of the Black Caucus with regards to Israel these days. What could you describe some of the pressures that there might be on the Black Caucus with regards to that, the lack of dialogue? I mean, there have been members of the Black Caucus who were vocal, such as former Congresswoman Cynthia McKinney. So can you describe the nature of the pressure?
I realise, but if either of you want to respond to either of those.
I'll just respond briefly. I think I've heard that term used once, but I didn't get the sense that it was very widespread. But certainly on the second part of your question, there are already quite a number of Israelis, and this is anecdotal based on people that I know who have chosen to move to the U.S. or other countries.
The official government figure 2 years ago was that 750,000 Israeli Jews live abroad, which is about 15% of the Jewish population.
So there's certainly an element of that. It's hard to determine the exact motivations, but I anecdotally would say, based on conversations I've had, there are many people who don't want to be part of that. They don't want to serve in the military.
I mean, I would just be a little cautious, on that front. I think in some ways, the wider context in which the whole question of Israel, Jewish identity, and so on occurs is in a Western world where I think Avram Berg made this point very well in his book about the Holocaust is over, we must rise from its ashes. A Western world has adopted the lessons of the Holocaust, that anti-Semitism has been marginalized in Western countries. Young Jewish Americans grow up without the specter of anti-Semitism over their heads, and as such make their decisions as integrated Americans, where they don't feel that same need to kind of retreat into a protected sort of environment, a separate environment, to separate themselves out of fear or even communal loyalty. So it's, as Peter Beinart says, it's more the ultra-Orthodox that continue to identify in that narrow sense, whereas I think for most secular young Jews, their Jewish identity is not a national identity. It's not. They see themselves as Americans, not as Jews first. And the identity Jewish doesn't imply a national identity, a different citizenship, a homeland that's somewhere other than where you're living now. So I think that by the same token, for young Israelis growing up in a country that's very successfully globalized its economy, that they're doing their military service and then they're going off to India and spending a year or two there, and they're traveling abroad and they're looking at Silicon Valley to set up companies and so on, that the same principles sort of apply, that those kids a lot of those kids just want to be part of a world in which national boundaries and sort of fixed national identities are a lot more fluid. So I think there could be a number of reasons why young Israelis would be moving abroad. It adds up to the same thing. In some ways, there again, Israel may be a victim of its own success. If the original motivation was to kind of create a haven, that place of safety. Well, that safety is a condition now that allows people to go and live abroad. You can be an Israeli and live in Amsterdam, and not feel like Anne Frank's story is going to repeat, and so on. So I think, there are a number of different factors in play.
I don't think the pressures brought to bear on members of Congressional Black Caucus are any different to the rest of the Congress by what some friends of mine called the status quo lobby, which I think is the best way of describing it on Israeli-Palestinian affairs. The point that I was making was I think that there was a quite accurate identification around that time in the 80s, perhaps a little earlier, perhaps a little later, that this was going to be a growing power. Well, certainly by the 80s, it was clear this was an important part of the Democratic Party, of Democratic representation in Congress, and we'd better get these people on board for Israel. And then they went about getting them on board for a status quo position on Israel the same way as you would get people on board for anything else, whether that's the role that donations and financial contributions play in politics here, whether that's taking people on the kind of standard status quo tour of Israel that different organizations put together. I think in the last years, on the D side, again, there's been an attempt to do the same with Hispanic caucus. although without this backdrop of Jewish black relations in the US. Likewise, what Tony referred to earlier, there was an identification. Who would have thought 25 years ago that the largest single lobbying day for a kind of right-wing Israel position in Congress would be organized by a group called Christians United for Israel? And that's the reality today, and some far-sighted people who want to maintain the status quo on this issue and who are pulling to the right identified evangelical dispensationalist Christian groups as a target audience that could be brought on board. So, I mean, I think that is what has gone on. You might want to add into the equation that the socioeconomic demographics of the districts which many of the members of Congressional Black Caucus represent mean that out-of-district, out-of-state financial contributions can be more important to that side of election campaigns. And I think people cottoned on to that and have been effective in driving some of those out-of-state contributions. The question I was really raising was that to the extent to which this begins to look more and more like a civil rights struggle, that people can draw those analogies to, will that support begin to peel away in significant degrees with members of Congressional Black Caucus, not exclusively with members of that caucus, but perhaps more potential there than elsewhere in many respects. If we've got any more questions, we'll take a last round of questions. If not, I'm going to see if Sasha or Tony have any. Are there any hands? No. So I'm going to see if you have anything more that you want to share or add. Otherwise, I'm going to thank you, which is what I'm apparently going to do. The books are on sale outside of Sasha's book. Both Sasha and Tony have come down from New York. I'm really glad you took the time to do that, and thank you so much for doing this.
Thanks for having us.